Welcome to the first ever video of the Connect and Transform YouTube channel. What you can see on the screen here is the channel's logo, which I created in about 3 minutes with a text-to-image AI prompt on meta.ai. It wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but it was close enough. I did have to open it in Photoshop, and I spent an hour or two probably removing certain elements and simplifying it. I wanted to keep it as simple as possible, so it is just a picture of a cat and a gear. So why is there a picture of a cat? Well, the name of my channel is Connect and Transform, and you take the first letter of those words, C-A-T, and every video ends up being a cat video no matter what it's about. Connect and Transform, why did I choose that as the name of the channel? Primarily because the name was available and because the name is generic enough to apply to many different domains. So it can apply to technology in general, it can apply to programming, software, electronics, hardware, microcontrollers, home improvement, renovations, maybe even like relationships. Connect and Transform is very generic. And I have two different images that we're going to use today. There's the one that's on screen now, and then this one here, where part of that hour or two that I spent in Photoshop, I spent removing the cat and trying to keep the gear as intact as possible. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see three resources here. There's the two images that I've displayed on screen, the full logo and just the gear component of the logo. And then there's also this font file. I did a quick internet search for which fonts are commonly used in YouTube video thumbnails, and this is one that came up, and this is a free-to-use version. It's not a commercial version. There were commercial versions in addition, but I made sure to choose a free one. So we're going to be using these three resources in the video today. And the purpose of today's video is to create a video thumbnail template. In this case, I'm going to do it within an SVG file using XML and CSS and these three external resources. And basically, then you could just swap out an image, swap out some text in the XML file, and open it in a browser, and then you can see the rendered image of your new video thumbnail and then take a screenshot or whatever. And of course, the process could be improved in the future. But we're going to go ahead. Actually, before we create our file from scratch, I want to give a moment to talk about some of the inspiration for this template. So I subscribe to a lot of different people on YouTube, and one of them is Max Velocity, and in his live videos, he uses what appears to be a template where about, let's say, 35–40% of the frame on the left is dedicated to text, and then the remaining portion to graphical elements on the right. And on the left-hand side where the text is, you can see that there's a gradient, color gradient, in his case, yellow and red, food colors, colors that get your attention. In my case, I used Photoshop and I picked a few colors off of my logo, off of that gear. And so my version of this is going to be a little bit more subtle, but it will be in line with the logo that I already have. So we're really not going to copy this template. We're just using it as a very rough guide. And we can see that there's also a mostly vertical yellow line in this case, and then just to the left of that, there's a little bit of a dark gradient just to the right of the yellow line that divides the left and right halves. And so that's pretty much all the inspiration that we're going to derive from this. So now we're going to begin by creating a brand new text document, and we're going to name it template.svg. We're going to open it in the browser. And the browser complains, basically, it doesn't know what to do with the document. And that makes sense because the document has no contents. So it doesn't know anything about XML namespace, for example. So we're going to create a root element, an SVG element. And it's going to have a couple attributes. One of them is going to be the XML namespace. This is like a boilerplate attribute that you could look up online and copy and paste. And I'll type that in just a moment. Another one here is XML NS xlink. This is required to link to external documents such as font files or images. So in our case, it will be required. And then we'll give it a width and a height. So what size are we going to make this? Based on the quick 2-minute research I've done, 1080p HD resolution is probably a good starting point. I may want to go up from there, but we will begin with 1920 by 1080. Now, I mentioned there's a couple of those boilerplate attributes. So I'm going to go ahead and fill those in now. So there's that one and that one. Next, we're going to want to add some CSS. So we're going to add a style tag. And then before we get into the style tag, we're just going to kind of make a skeleton here. We're going to have some definitions. We're going to define our linear gradients, and then our actual document elements are going to reference those linear gradients. Let's begin with an initial, just a rectangle. And rectangle, the X and Y components are going to be 0, so we don't specifically need to include those attributes. We're just going to copy and paste the width and height. And then we're going to fill it with a linear gradient that we need to define. So now we're going to define a linear gradient. Okay, we're going to give this linear gradient an ID. We're going to call it gold gradient because the general colors in my logo are white, black, grays, golds. And then we're going to copy this ID over here. That way, this rectangle is now referencing this linear gradient as the thing to fill the rectangle with. So the linear gradient is going to contain a couple of stop elements. And those are going to have a certain offset. And then it's either going to have a stop opacity or a stop color. For this particular gradient, the opacity is just going to be 1, so we're only going to be changing the stop color. Now, I picked these colors off of my logo, off of the gear in Photoshop, so I'm not making these up on the fly. I've written these down. So that's one of them. And that's the other one. So one thing that I decided this morning when I went through this exercise is that I did not want the gradient to extend the entire vertical range. I wanted the top 30%. So from 0 to 30, I wanted it to just be this solid color so that there was less changing and going on in the top left of the thumbnail. And then I wanted the gradient to occur from 30 to 100. So I'm going to go ahead and save on the right-hand side, and then I'm going to switch the left-hand side over to the browser and refresh. Okay, so we see a linear gradient, but it's going from left to right, not top to bottom. So we need to add an attribute called gradient transform. And we're going to rotate it 90 degrees, refresh. Okay, so we see the top 30% is a solid color and then a gradient from 30% to 100%. And that is precisely what we are after. Now, the next thing is we want to create a mask so that we only see this gradient on the leftmost, let's say 40%, and then on the right-hand side could just be black. So we are going to copy this, but instead of turning it 90 degrees, we're only going to turn it 1.75. So it's going to be almost a vertical gradient. And from 0 to 41.6%, we want the opacity to be 0. And we're not going to define the stop color because black happens to be the default, so we're just going to take advantage of that. And then right after 41.6%, we're just going to say 41.7. All of a sudden, we're going to shift to an opacity of 1, which means completely black, completely opaque. And then we're going to gradually let's see, completely black. Okay, so I'm going to make that 43. Let's just save that and refresh. Okay, nothing changed because I forgot to reference. Well, A, I forgot to rename the ID to gold gradient mask, and B, I foolishly forgot to create another rectangle that uses it. Okay, so there we go. So now we've got two rectangles using two different linear gradients. One of them is the gold gradient from top to bottom, and the other is the opacity gradient from transparent to opaque black going from left to right. So now we're going to do one final linear gradient. And we're going to call this one a shading mask. And its purpose is going to be to ease in from the middle to the right-hand side. So from 0 to 41.6%, we're going to keep the opacity at 0. And then right after that, at 41.7, we're going to shift to an opacity of 1, and then we're slowly going to go down 0.8, 0.6, 0.4, 0.2, and 0. But we're going to do this at varying speeds. So I'm going to go ahead and just type this in. So you'll see that from 1 to 0.8 happens in 0.3% of the range. And that range, that percentage of the range is going to gradually increase. In fact, it's going to double at each step. Okay, so nothing is referencing the shading mask yet. So we're going to create a new rectangle that references the shading mask. And so you'll see that the shading mask is on the screen now. It's a little hard to see because I don't have a feature image in place yet. So let's go ahead and add the feature image now. So we're going to use an image element. We're going to give it a class name so that we can add some style to it later. We'll come back to the CSS in a moment. We're going to reference this logo.png file that's in the same folder. We're going to give it an X and a Y value. and we're going to give it a width and a height. So we're going to limit it to 1000 by 1000. And for the Y value, it's going to be down 40 because the maximum height is 1000, but the maximum height of the total canvas is 1080. So cut that in half to center it vertically, 40. And then I'm going to shift it over 800 because that's what I found looked good and worked this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and save and refresh. And so now we've pulled in our main feature image. In this case, it is my logo image. In the future, it will probably not have so much transparency as the logo image does. So we'll be able to see this shading mask better with another example. But it is there, it is present, and it is functional. And then on top of that shading mask, so lower down in the document, we're going to add a line. And lines have x1, y1, x2, and y2 attributes. And then I'm also going to have a stroke, which is the color, and a stroke width. So we're going to give it a stroke width of 10. As for the color, that's the third one that I grabbed from Photoshop this morning. So there's the color. Now, as for the Y values, it's going to extend all the way from top to bottom. So it's going to extend from 0 to the full 1080. As for the X values, I'm going to use the ones that I found this morning that work well. So 800 and 740. So we'll go ahead and save and then refresh. And you can see that that line appeared right on that transition. So there is still a subtle transition there, but for the most part, it's now hidden by this centered line. Now, the next thing I want to do is we're going to create another image also of the logo. It's going to have a certain X and Y coordinate. Okay, and then we're going to give it a width and a height that is a little bit smaller. So we're going to limit that one to 150 by 150. And so what that'll do is that'll create a small version of the logo in the upper right-hand side of the thumbnail template. And so this one will always be the logo, but this one will likely be some other image each time. Okay, and then we need to add some text eventually. And the text is going to have an X, a Y, and we're going to go ahead and create a class name for every single text element so that we can target them individually. So I'm going to call this first one an action. We're creating or we're coding or we're building, whatever it is that we're actually doing. And then here, I'm going to duplicate that class name here so that I can reference it, change it, make use of it. And then we're probably going to have some default text styles, and then we're going to have our custom font. Okay, so let me go back over to the folder here, and let's grab the file name of our asset. So we're going to give this file a name, and we're naming it that. And then we got to actually link to it. So there's our link to the font file. So now we've got this font family name. So we're just going to use that as a default for all text elements. And then we're going to add some other defaults. And not all of these will be used, but that's okay. So FFF is white. So we're going to default to white text with a black surround, black border, which in this context is called a stroke. And 000 is black. We're going to give it a default stroke width of 9 pixels. And then there's one final thing that we need to do. We need to specify the paint order as stroke first and then fill in order for it to appear the way we want. Let me do a quick refresh here. So now we can see this example text creating, so you can see it's white text with black surround. So we do still need to modify the font size. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that, refresh. Okay, it's looking a little more readable maybe. I'm gonna copy this into a few different places. And we're gonna create a few more text lines. So after the action, I'm calling it series. There's probably any number of names I could have used, and I'll probably change my mind in the future. But this series is part of that around the first video. So we're creating a first video. And then I have a line for skills. Okay, so let's make sure to copy that up there. So here is where we're going to say, like, we're using XML, we're using CSS, we're creating it from scratch. And then after skills, I'm going to call it episode. Okay, we're going to copy that up there. And this is going to be part 1 of doing something. So now what is the something that we're doing? We're creating a thumbnail template. And I'm going to call this just title. Okay, so now we've got all of our lines of text. Each line of text has a certain class name, and those class names are copied over here. I'm going to go ahead and put in the appropriate font sizes now. 50, 200, 50, 100, and 160. Let's save. Let's refresh real quick. Okay, so we still need to edit the positioning of these elements. So I'm going to edit the Y position of these. Now these two have the same Y position because I have one to the left and one to the right. So I need to edit this to shift the second one over more on the x-axis, and then we'll continue with positioning the last of these. Okay, refresh. All right, so text is looking a lot better. There is a couple more things that I wanted to add. So I'm decreasing the stroke width in some of these cases because the font sizes are smaller, or I didn't want those particular bits of font to gather as much weight on the page. And then these two smaller ones where it says SVG, XML, CSS, and from scratch, I wanted that line to be italic. Okay. I'm not completely sold on the italics, but I think it's better than not because I didn't want that to be the focus of the thumbnail. but I did want to include the information. So now we're down to just the last couple of things. I want to add a drop shadow to the main feature image. And this drop shadow might be a little intense for this particular image, but it looks reasonable with other example images. Now, the only thing that I still want to add is I've used the main logo, I've used the font file, but I've not used the gear. So I want to add a couple of gears like intermeshing with each other. And I think I want to add those just to the left of this line up at the top here. And so I've got these two image elements, and we're going to link them to the gear file. So we'll need to go back and position them with XY. Let's modify the sizing real quick. So let's make them a little smaller. Let's make them smaller than the feature image, but not as small as the one in the upper right. And then we also want to make them a little bit more subtle. So we're going to make them nearly transparent. And then as for positioning, I'm just going to use the values that worked out for me this morning. Okay, so with those two in place, when I refresh, now we see these two gears intermeshing with each other. And that is it. That is our video thumbnail template. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, some process could be added to streamline things, but for now I can just go into this file, I can edit the text, I can edit the positioning of the text over here, I can edit the specific font size, and I can go to this feature image and I can edit the image that it's pulling in and then use that as a guide for creating a new template, a new thumbnail for every video. So thank you for watching. Future videos should be better planned out and more streamlined. And I hope to see you in the next one. We're going to create a series where we're creating a checkers game from scratch. So that would include game logic, visual styling, creating the board, creating the pieces, animating jumps, animating moves, and so on. So hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.